A profession with a responsibility to care for others can present its own set of challenges for the human beings in the role, including a lack of focus on their emotional health and wellness. We'll talk with an HR executive whose lived experience has become a passion for psychologically healthy and safe workplaces. Up next on this episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. As workplace mental health has become a global priority, there's a greater focus on addressing psychosocial hazards. Each week, we look at psychological safety from an occupational health and safety perspective. Let's talk psychological health and safety. Welcome to this week's Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. I'm your host, Dr. I. David Daniels, and I want to thank you for tuning in. Each week, we seek to increase awareness of the importance of psychological health and safety by learning from the lived experiences, research, and expertise of our guests, as well as advocating strategies to reduce harm and minimize vulnerability to psychosocial hazards in the American workplace. So, a surprisingly high percentage of HR professionals are exposed to psychosocial hazards in the workplace. A common example is undermining professional integrity, which means HR professionals are made to feel inept in their jobs or have employees or colleagues who go over their heads to get a decision made higher up. This can cause a severe confidence crisis for the professional. HR professionals are also at times bullied by an employee with whom they've been involved in an HR issue, which suggests that there needs to be a change in the culture or attitude towards the role HR professionals play in organizations. Others were being bullied or harassed by the immediate line manager, which limited how they dealt with the issue as they were bypassed by that manager. Some of those bullied by their managers dealt with it by doing nothing or ignoring the issue as they felt that they couldn't do anything to actually address the issue they were experiencing based on the seniority of the bully. But motivated by life experience, my guest this episode has become an advocate for policies to protect all workers, including HR professionals and all workers from toxic workplaces. So, to get into the conversation, we'll start, as I so often do, with an introduction of my guest by my guest with this question: Who is Kim Williams?
Thank you. I loved how you teed that up. That was awesome. I actually think you kind of summed it up because Kim Williams is someone who is very focused on the experience of HR, which we just don't talk about enough. It wasn't even something I was totally aware of until those some of those things that you just described happened to me. And then, like so many people who go through these really toxic experiences, you almost become an evangelical and you want to make sure no one else goes through something similar because it definitely leaves a scar. But you're absolutely right. I do think as a field, we're not respected enough. I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think sometimes small companies, they take a front desk receptionist and say, "Oh, will you plan the birthday parties and process the benefits enrollments?" And that can color how people see HR. But then I also think, the system at large, like, I would really love to see like SHRM and some of these other bigger groups really dive in on training on how to manage up. They talk about like, oh, okay, we fix a toxic culture by, you know, let's have everyone do training. But what do you do if the CEO doesn't do it and the CEO is the problem? It's kind of silent there. And then the last point, which you touched on too, is HR professionals, and I'm guilty of this myself. We forget that we have rights as a regular employee, or we're so terrified that if we exercise those rights, we'll never be hired again. No one will ever trust us again. And I'm happy to report, at least in my case, I did challenge those demand rights as an employee and was hired again and have been fine. And so it doesn't always have to be as bad as we think it will
Right,
be.
absolutely, absolutely. Wow, so much to pour into. One other standard question I ask folks when they come on is, when you hear psychological health and safety, what does that mean to you?
It's It's funny because you and I have talked about this before. And a lot of times my framing is so hideously simple of carrots and sticks, and and so, like I live in this world where partly because I come from the public sector, so I've dealt with very the egos, people who can't be fired, people who that you don't have these levers that you can kind of pull, and so I've dealt with plenty of bullies that might recognize those words, probably like terms like psychological safety. It feels less threatening. It feels less about them. But in my philosophy, while I think that's beautiful and I think that's wonderful, I'm really big on scary legislation that will ruin someone's careers if they don't do better, which probably doesn't sound like a very psychologically safe thing for those folks. so, but I think the two should complement each other. I think it's really important that we are, pulling in experts like yourself, to say here are the positive ways that we can shape an environment, really help people. But there's got to be an accountability piece, and that can be really tough for folks and get really uncomfortable. But they belong together in my book.
A-
So.
Absolutely, absolutely. Tell me a little bit about how your interest in human resources was sparked in the first place. I mean, of all the things that people do, I don't know that folks look over into the crib and say, "Oh, they're going to be a wonderful HR professional someday." So, so what's your story? How did you become interested?
Yeah, it's funny. I kind of landed in it by accident. I was actually a history professor for 7 years. Loved telling stories and getting folks excited about a subject that they weren't very excited with to begin with, and then after a while, I started working with diplomats in some of these programs, and so my master's degree is actually in underwater archaeology. I kind of kept one foot in archaeology. For anyone out there considering that as a career, it's not a career; it's an expensive hobby. So, it was really interesting couple of years working in it. And actually, it was through that I began to meet diplomats who were kind of out in the world. I traveled a lot internationally, and so as I was coming across these folks, they're like, "You should consider the Foreign Service." And that's where I learned that the Foreign Service exam is really just a history test, which is probably why so many people fail it. And so I was like, okay, I didn't tell a soul that I took the test because it would have been very embarrassing for me if I had done poorly. And did well, was invited to interview, got into the Foreign Service. And I was like, look, I'm good at lecturing and, educational and cultural programs. Like, this is my wheelhouse. And so I had actually joined to become a public diplomacy officer. But a little bit like the military, when you first start your career as a diplomat, you're directed. You don't get to choose your career. They kind of assign you for the first few tours. And so early on, they assigned me as a management officer, and I was terror stricken. I was like, I'm a liberal arts major. Like, you can't do this to me. And I was so nervous. And they're like, you're going to take over for HR. And so I report to the office, and I'm like, what's going to happen? And I get this phone call, and it was my very first phone call, very first day. And this guy who sounded like, the creepy guy from Silence of the Lambs. And he was like, "Hello, Kimberly. You're not finding me meaningful work, Kimberly." And I like hung up with him and called my boss, and I'm like, "What's happening?" He's like, "Oh, he's trying to sue you." And I'm like, "What?" So it turned out that this guy had been in big trouble, had broken a law, was at home, with what is it, the device around your, he was like on house arrest. And because he still had to be processed out of the system, he had lost his security clearance, but he wouldn't be able to get promoted if I didn't find him meaningful work. And so I was like, this is awesome. Yeah, I had gone from this place where I would lecture in front of 2,000 people, have no emotional connection to anyone, to like really in this like high drama, very complicated, very messy space. And I just fell in love with it and never looked back. So,
Okay. I can't say I've heard that kind of story on the first day of work. So, wow, wow. Hannibal Lecter, I think, is the guy you're talking about.
yes, that's who he sounded
Clarice.
like. Yes.
Oh my goodness. Okay. So, I'm a little taken by that. I got to be able to process that because, you, So here's what I think about when you share that story, though. I think about the importance of orientation when you share that story, because you were exposed to a psychosocial hazard on the first phone call, and I don't know if anyone told you that was going to happen. They didn't share,
No.
and
No.
and that really is the issue. So organizations will hire, select, promote, appoint, whatever process they use to put people into these roles, and they're going to be exposed to psychosocial hazards, which are, things that could be interpreted or experienced or felt as a threat to the person. It makes you nervous and makes you kind of concerned, makes you think. It's not as if you're going to crumble under it, but it's like getting smacked in the face and nobody told you that the hand was coming. And that was a known situation that someone could have shared. Well, here's some of the things that are going on to include this fellow, again, who sounds like Hannibal Lecter. Um, but here's how we're going to, here's some of the guidance we could give you, but here's some of the supports we have for you. That's the kind of, some people think I'm a little nutty by suggesting all that stuff. But what about the physical hazards that you're exposed to on the first day? Hopefully, somebody told you where the exits were or where the first aid kit was. And what I'm finding is a lot of organizations don't do that either. So you're tossed into this circumstance where things that you had no way to prepare for are just tossed in your face, and some people respond well and some crumble on day one, and it just goes downhill or uphill from there. So wow, I'm going to have to again continue to think about that one. But this experience turns into it was it a full time HR role or a significant portion of your work was HR related?
Yeah, no, that became full time, and I didn't want to go back. I mean, you're absolutely right. There's plenty of other people who wouldn't like that, and I think if I didn't have the history I had, I mean, I mean, was, like this was like, oh, they're going to sue you. Like I'm personally liable for this guy's set of circumstances in a way that, didn't feel fair. I didn't arrest him. I didn't commit whatever crime he had committed. and but he was kind of exploiting holes in the rules and the slow State Department discipline path, and taking advantage of the fact, well, he can't come in, he can't do this, and yet he's going to try and get me. But at the same time, I was already in that culture of throwing people in the deep end. And, I'm sure, like military folks, I know you were a firefighter. I have to imagine you probably went through tons of things like that where, yeah, yeah, they were quite similar. And yours were probably way scarier because they were very physical in nature.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a kind of a yeah, but to that though. When I have conversations about the fire rescue career, they did an excellent job preparing me to go into buildings on fire. That part. Oh boy, you knew exactly. As a matter of fact, it was fun. I'll share. There is nothing like it. Nothing like the adrenaline rush of crawling down a hallway with, flames going over your head. But what they didn't prepare us for is the emotional and mental stuff that goes on. Nobody tells you that. So I it took a while before I went to my first real fire. It took like 3 shifts before I saw somebody die in front of me. And that's the kind of thing that at the time there is more conversation now about, again, emotional and mental health, but there was none then, and you just deal with it. I'm a 21-year-old kid who's never seen anybody die before. I've been to a funeral or two, but they already died. I mean, this I'm literally watching someone take their last breath is a bit traumatic when you're not prepared for it. And that connects back to the conversation that we're having, is that we well, as employers or appointing authorities or whatever you want to call them, somebody decides to expose you to that. And generally I go along with it because I'm new. I don't, I took the job. Hopefully I read the job description. That's a whole nother conversation about horrific how horrific the job descriptions are. And I think I may have mentioned this before, but my graduate degree is in HR. I've never been a practitioner, but I'm certainly, I know how to write a job description, all that type of thing. And I've said this before, I have issues with these job descriptions that say other duties to be assigned later, and this kind of nebulous out there. No, 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 no. How about a category of things, maybe, or something like that? But and it gives the organization the opportunity to just make stuff up and expose you to things that you're just not prepared for. I'm not suggesting at all that I wouldn't do it, but I just need a little time to go. I need some training, some orientation, something to get me ready for what I'm getting ready to be exposed to.
No, and I think even worse than that, because I've seen a lot of those for, police department, fire department, having worked in public organizations that hire those kinds of folks, it will have, must be able to lift 80 pounds. Like it will list physical things, but to your point, it won't talk about like the other psychological list.
Absolutely. Now, I attribute a lot of that to a lot of these things were developed for and by dudes who are really focused on the physical stuff, but don't seem to recognize that our mind and our body are connected, and connected for very good reason. And when you try to separate the two, one of them is going to suffer, and ultimately they both will suffer in the long run because they're just connected. No one experiences physical harm without first experiencing psychosocial harm. And what we've taught each other in our society is ignore the psychosocial stuff, ignore how you're feeling, push through it, whatever. And then when my back's out or my knees, doesn't work anymore, my bad shoulder or whatever it is, or some other type of physical thing pops up, then we get interested, and sometimes it's a little late when we do that. So um, share with me for those, because we're kind of having a little bit of a HR insider conversation here, but what about people outside of HR? What could you share with folks who they've never really been in HR? They have these ideas they have about it. Share something that folks outside of HR might not know in terms of what it feels like emotionally.
Yeah, I love that question because I'm on so many threads and so many like closed conversations with HR professionals. They really do take a beating. There's a lot of punching down in HR. And a lot of them are trying to advocate, and a lot of them are in a lot of pain because they see things that are wrong and they're trying to figure out how to go against something. I also find that, like, if you're unhappy with how your HR shop is functioning, it's a direct reflection of your CEO. It's a direct reflection of the top. If someone is weak or not functioning, well, they were hired by somebody, and so it's either that someone thinks that role, that's all they can do, they don't understand what the potential is of that role, or they want it that way. They don't want someone who will challenge them, and they like that kind of top down environment. And if you have a toxic culture, you always have to look at the top. I've never seen a situation where you can't separate that. And so if you've got a top person who is bullying others, they're probably also bullying HR. And there's this power dynamic there, which makes it, HR is having to manage up and say, "Hey, boss, you're doing X, you're doing Y. These are I want you to pass a policy that will hold you accountable." and and those aren't always easy sales. But I think that's why I spend a lot of time too trying to help HR fill in those training gaps to figure out how to overcome their own fear, same fear other people may be experiencing in those moments when their job is directly threatened for engaging in those conversations, how to baby step into it, how to protect themselves, how to do all these other things, and then by extension to also help regular any other type of employee do the same thing, so that they have an HR person who in their heart wants to do the right thing but isn't equipped. They can actually further that process by, like, say you come to me and I'm in HR and you're like, "Hey, HR lady, I'm looking at this Telsa lawsuit. This is the exact same set of circumstances as what I have, and they just sued for 130 million. Is this the route I need to go?" So now, when I go to my boss and say, "Hey, we have a complaint, or we have a complaint that could be ruinous," you've now equipped me to do something that lets the HR person say, "I'm here to help you, boss. Like, this is a real issue. Let's try and tackle that." Versus, "Please just do the right thing." And so the more informed everyone is about the leverage that they have, the rights that they have, I think the safer everyone is.
Do you need more psych health and safety in your life? Then head over to the Flourish GX Academy for several free on-demand e-learning courses. If you're an internal professional, follow FlourishDX on Eventbrite to register for any of our free fortnightly interactive webinars. Our flagship professional practice program is also exclusively available for internal professionals. The 12-week course blends theory, applied practice, and interaction with other professionals through live lectures and a monthly community of practice session. Find out more about all these learning opportunities or inquire about a bespoke in-house training at the FlourishDX Academy. www.45003.org. Now back to this episode.
I'm now harkening back a little bit to your opener. If you would mind, what what happened to you? I mean, what is it that got you? You got into HR, but is there a particular circumstance or a set of circumstances that caused you to really start to get focused on how tough the job? A lot of us go into things because they look exciting. Even if we got tossed into it, we get really energized about it and excited about it and are off and running. And then something happens or a series of things happens that cause us to take another look and recognize that it isn't all that we expected. So, I mean, what can you share about that situation for you?
Happy to. So for me, I think a lot of it had to do with the way I quote grew up in HR. I think that's so pivotal. Like when folks are working in the early part of their career, they're observing so many things. They're observing heads of their department, their leaders up above them, and how they engage in situations. So I had really good fortune. I worked with amazing leaders, high integrity. I mean, they're diplomats, so they should be able to handle, not everybody can, even if they have that title, but I was really lucky where, I was working with folks that just had really like iron backbones. They didn't care if someone was 5 pay grades above them. They would go in there and be like, we need to have a conversation. What you just did was wrong. And they would give them the business no matter what. So I actually thought that was normal. And so when I left there and I started working at these smaller agencies, I was like astonished at like good old boy behaviors, one set of rule for everybody else, but not for the top, and some of these things. And so I was going in there and saying, like, hey, you just said these things. We need to have a conversation. And they were like, get rid of her. And it was, and so for me, it very quickly became what I called integrity test. And so, for me, that's my North Star with stuff. Like if I know something is hurting somebody and I'm in that room and I have an opportunity to say something, I physically cannot live with myself if I don't. The pain of changing who I am is greater than what could potentially happen with a job. Still didn't like it. It was very uncomfortable. It was very threatening. It was very stressful. I'm a single mom. And so I had, a bunch of these experiences and I had survived them. But then the real critical one was at, one agency where I was at where, head of HR, and it was the chief executive that was just, and I'm being kind here, like a low key terrorist, like just an awful, awful person, had been an awful person for decades. And it was just this open secret, destroyed human beings. And so it put me in a pickle because I couldn't open an investigation in my own shop because I can't ask my people to investigate me. That would be tainted. And so I couldn't go to HR. I was HR. I had to do the next best thing, which is go to the attorneys, in the organization. And when I went to them, they're like, oh, that person's a nightmare. We don't want to deal with them. And, it's just not the correct answer. And so they're like, you need to go to the board. And I did. And I sat there alone with the board. And I had some who were sympathetic, but I did not have the majority. And the general consensus was we've known forever. But they get things done. And then one of them, a very close friend of the chief executive, ran out, told him about the conversation. So the next time I walked in for my one on one, it was like walking into a buzzsaw. So at that moment, I was like, I'm 100% alone right now, and I have to figure out what I'm going to do. And so I was like, all right, I'm just going to document. And so I ended up, and I always talk about this because I think it's so important to not have any shame around it. I was scared out of my mind, to be clear. I was new on a job. I was like, this is going to leave a black mark on my resume. I don't know if I'm going to find anything. I'm a single mom. Like it felt life threatening. So I always like to put that out there because I know that that's real for people. And so I documented everything. I'm like, here's where you lied. Here's where you did this. Here's how you're treating me. This is unacceptable. This is this. And it was like this 5-page memo of everything, where there had been violations and our own policy, everything else. And I remember my hands were shaking as I was typing this out because I'm like, I'm going to get fired at the end of this. But I want this discoverable. I BCC'd my Gmail account, you know, copied in attorneys, forwarded it to the board. I'm just like, I'm going to lean all the way in here. And I remember being so afraid in that moment that I finished the draft, saved it as a draft, ran to my car, and as I was pulling out of the parking lot, I hit send in my Outlook. So like I was literally running away when I did it. But I was like, whatever. This is this is how I could get it out. And so I came back the next day and no one said a word. No one ever said a word. And then things were nice for a while, and then slowly kind of through that cycle of abuse, they couldn't hold it anymore and it'd come back, send another letter, kept pushing the board. And so basically I walked along this process of, I'm just going to run this investigation on my own as best as I can figure out. I'm going to document it. I'm going to try and scrub my own. I'm not, get my emotions out of it, cut all that out, just the facts, ma'am, with simple statements. Here's where you violate the policy. Here's where you violate, you know, federal law. Here's where I am entitled to a timely investigation when I ask for it. And so I just kept citing all these things. And then as an HR person, I was even able to throw in there and say, hey, board chair, not only have I raised this multiple times and you have failed to respond to this in a timely fashion, which I'm entitled to, but I get these same complaints. I get less complaints. Here's how many have come through my office in the last year. Here's how many resolved. Like, we're doing this for everyone else. And so at that point, they ended up hiring an outside investigator, which is what I had been pushing for. And my original claim, which at the time was based on what I was observing, is all the targets were women. It wasn't just me. There was a pattern. And so that was one of the things I said. This is a clear EEO violation. You need to investigate. My best guess, because as a complainant, I wasn't privy to all that. I'm pretty sure a man came forward. And so my complaint, it was no longer an EEO violation. It was no longer based on protected characteristics. And so at the end of everything, I got a letter sustaining allegations of abuse. Those exact words were in there. And they said, but, no harm, no foul. We didn't break our policy. We didn't break EEO. Let us know if anything else happens again, knowing full well that this person's now more empowered. They had just come out of this and this was going to get a lot worse. And so I immediately protected myself. I immediately went to my doctor with my letter, said, I want FMLA, I want to take time off. And so I took a few weeks off and just let them sit. I'm like, I'm not going to engage. I'm not going to do anything. I filed a workers' comp claim with that letter, which won. In fact, because I had documented it so well, I had a phone book of information. And so the insurance adjuster actually said this was so bad that if there was ever another complaint coming from my agency tied to this person, they would just auto approve it on the spot. And so, it wasn't that it was for a ton of money. I wanted to set that record. I wanted to, get that going so that the next person would have an easier time than I did. And then I got a lawyer and negotiated a nice settlement and said, here's everything I have. If you want to, stand by your decision, I can stand by mine. By the way, all this is publicly available. And they were very happy to come to the table and it was settled extremely fast. And so through all that, I learned that HR has way more leverage than they tend to remember. I knew where everybody was buried. I knew every attorney who had ever sued them and for how much and under what circumstances. I am the last person on earth you want to engage with. And I spent a year asking nicely, pleading and doing all those things. And at the end of the day, I understood all those rules. I understood what I was entitled to. And so I like to try and help HR folks in that situation remember that they have that kind of power to use for themselves and for others. But to some degree, we all can access some of this stuff.
Wow. I don't know that I'd ever heard that story to that detail, if at all, and it is it brings up some memories of those of us who've had these kinds of circumstances, uh, they've experienced those kinds of circumstances. And I particularly find the similarity between your story and what gets experienced as safety professionals as well. That's another group of people who are often bullied, targeted, mistreated, what have you. So you get hired in to be the quote unquote safety guy or gal, and then you find these, in some cases, horrific circumstances that are going to get people eventually injured or killed. And then when you bring them up, it's like, yeah, no, well, we really didn't. Yeah, perhaps you got this wrong. We really didn't want to fix that. We just wanted somebody to hang it on. It's probably going to be you because you found it. That goes on. That goes on often, and because our, again, from a safety perspective, the only thing that most safety professionals have to lean on is the OSH Act, which is really very limited. It has 19,700 words or so, been around for 53 years. It mentions psychological twice. So it is built to protect people from physical things. And in some cases, it doesn't do a great job of that either. It just doesn't, because we just haven't built the infrastructure to really. Doing some research, and I may be a little bit off on these numbers, but the Securities and Exchange Commission has like 4,500 people to oversee and make sure that our security system is safe and all that type of thing. OSHA has 1,800. So, and I think big employers know that. I mean, you're not going to get, unless there's a big complaint, they don't have the time to come around and check all that stuff. And then for those of us who are in state and local government, who aren't even covered by it. So there's this whole incentive structure for people to continue to do these really ridiculous things that are ultimately, they get settled in a bunch of lawsuits. But again, to your point, particularly when we're talking about public entities, that's taxpayer money that's going to pay off, that could be used for all kinds of other services. It's going to pay off lawyers and settlements and that type of thing. And often the person who is the perpetrator is also the victim of, because they became that way for a reason. Somebody abused and misused them and treated them like trash. So they got their opportunity to get in a position to do it to somebody else, and they did. And the other thing I'll say, while I'm on a rant here, is that, but this is also, in my view, about the organization and the culture that allows it. Who hired that person? Who put that person in that position to have influence over so many people? And then, well, because they make money, it's okay.
No, you're right, and then never held them accountable, and so it's about fear and a lack of courage all over the place, and so, yeah, you've got, heads of business that are afraid to lose a valuable employee, so they look the other way, knowing something's bad because they don't wanna take the hit financially, and then you've got, employees that through, 1 billion data points to confirm that they won't be protected. Everyone has horror stories or knows people who spoke out and it didn't end well. And so they're silenced and just suffer quietly there too. And every time someone says something out loud, it's such a brave act. And more and more people are doing it. I mean, just yesterday, yeah, like Miss America, Miss Teen USA, I was like, good for you. Like every time someone steps forward like that, that's so huge in terms of breaking down that silence that hurts millions.
Yeah, it makes me think of it. I have a couple other curiosities as we, start to put the brakes on a little bit. But I think of Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail when he talks about the fact that it's not just what the dastardly bad people are doing, but it's the appalling silence of the good people that's often the issue. And as people of goodwill, people who see that something is wrong, people who take the integrity test and actually pass it, speak up. That's what really gives me courage. That really encouragement, I should say, that this is changing. It is. It is. It's going to get better because fewer and fewer and fewer people are willing to take the abuse that some people want to pass out. At least I heard from our good friend Torrance Monet suggest that only about 4% of the leaders are creating, a good percentage of the damage anyway. So I think we've got them numbers wise, but we just have to continue to keep the foot on the gas pedal and continue to speak out about circumstances and situations that just aren't effective. And and what I'm finding is to be able to do that too, and me not be I'm not angry about it. I'm not. I don't have anything against that behavior. Is just not effective. That's all. And it's not effective. It's not ever going to be effective. And I know you're probably a little damaged yourself. I get it. Uh, but we're going to have to help create a scenario where you're not exposed to other people while you're getting help. That's the idea. So I'm not mad at you. It's not this is not retribution or anything like that, because that's that same sometimes that same kind of trauma that comes out in our own actions. But no, I'm good. I'm good. That's just not going to work, and we can't allow that to continue to, can't allow people to continue to be exposed to that type of thing. So again, so while I'm dreaming, um, if you let's say you have a startup or a new organization and they want a couple of tips on how to create an environment where this doesn't happen on the front end. What should they be thinking about from an HR perspective?
Those first HR hires are critical, and give them an integrity test. So, like when I go out and hire, like I give them scenarios, even for lower ranking HR folks. Like you're in a meeting with one other person and a C level executive, and that C level executive says something racist. What do you do? And so I want to know, do they wet the floor? Do they like, oh, I'm going to go run and tell somebody? And I actually check to see, will they engage? And so that right there is make it or break. I don't care if they know HRAS tool. Like I can teach anybody anything. That is really difficult to do. And so my whole team is pretty damn amazing. Like and they they're like they have high EQs. They know I have their back. They're willing to do the right thing. And then we carry that forward in the organization. And so but likewise too, that close relationship with the CEO, because like I also have an amazing CEO. I mean, I'm not here talking about how to sue your boss all the time. Like that would make a lot of bosses uncomfortable. But he's not, he'll like it on Facebook, and it's because he has a high degree of integrity. He wants to do the right thing. And so he's not scared if I'm out there talking about this. And I'm not worried about it because, like, I know our house is in order. I'm running it. So I can talk about these things and say, no, we live our values. Is every day perfect? No. Do we still have human beings being human beings? Absolutely. But we do have a culture where we do not run from hard conversations. We lean right in, and at any level of an organization, me as a VP, I'll pick up the phone and say, what's going on? Let's have a conversation. And a lot like you, I'm cold hard math. I'm not, oh, you're a bad person. You do bad things. It's just, like this is our culture. This is who we are. These are the parameters. How are we going to get back in there? And if we can't, we can't. But, we'll have a different conversation, but we will absolutely have a conversation.
Right,
We don't
right, right,
run.
right, right. Yeah, I have found that in some cases, the most charitable, the kindest, the most rewarding thing you can do for people is help them be successful doing something else, really. Because they're just, once we've done, but again, my issue is sometimes we don't do all the front work. So, uh, with regard to psychosocial hazards, there's this hierarchy of controls. It talks about first you try to eliminate the hazard, then you try to substitute it for something that's less hazardous, and then you try to redesign the work, and then you try to educate the person on the hazards because you can't get rid of it, but how are they better informed so they can respond to it? But then ultimately, it might come down to some change on the part of the person. We've done everything we could. We were kind and reasonable and objective about the way we did it, but sometimes there isn't a match, despite our best efforts. And some of this gets a little wild for people when I suggest it, but I honestly think we ought to have relationships with other organizations and companies and such to say that, look, we've had a conversation with some folks down the street, and there's a role that might fit a little bit better. We've talked to them. They're certainly willing. They have a couple of steps you'd have to take, but tried to grease the skids for you, so to speak. We think that's going to work better because and we don't honestly. We think you're a good human being, but this is not a fit. It really isn't. And we've tried as best as we could. And we don't certainly want to put you out on the street if we don't have to. So here's the option that we have. I think that'd be a really unique kind of environment for people to be in. Maybe it pays a lot less money or whatever it is, but it's not, you're a bad person, you're fired, we toss you out on the street, and then 3 weeks later, we're wondering why you came back with a gun to try to kill us all. You see what I mean? I think sometimes we don't. These are human beings as well. Even the perpetrators are human beings as well that are many times damaged and such. And I just think we ought to have as much compassion as possible. And at a certain point, I got compassion, but you need to go to jail over that. You know, again, even in that case, I'm not mad at you, but that's the consequence of the decision that you made. We tried our best to work it out. You didn't. So here's the police. They're here to take you away. That's kind of, and I don't see that as a dispassion. I think that's just important. But it's not that you're a bad person. It isn't. Is that you've done a bad thing. And there's a consequence to it. And so while you're thinking about it for the next 20 years, maybe you'll just find religion or whatever. One other thing I can't leave without talking about something that I heard that you shared. So your daughter has recently taken interest in getting something that we've spent a little bit of time working on, the Workplace Psychological Safety Act passed in Washington D.C. So tell me more about that. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so my kid's amazing. I've jokingly referred to her as counselor since she was little because she'd rather spend 45 minutes arguing about how why she shouldn't clean her room instead of taking 5 minutes to clean her room. So she loves to argue and she's good at it. So part of it is like me jokingly trying to redirect her arguing skills for good. But she had gone through kind of a tough experience herself with her school to such a degree where very similar set of circumstances. They were refusing to engage, refusing to help her. We tried to work with them for over a year. It was really, really bad. We ended up getting a lawyer, went to mediation, and she destroyed them. And I was sitting there with this 15-year-old kid, and mediations are scary. They're scary for me. I mean, they're scary for a lot of adults. And it's me and her attorney. And then there's like this screen full, like 8 people on the, other side of the table. And she's holding my hand. I knew she was nervous, but from, here up on camera, she was so eloquent. She was so poised. And that mediator was like, you do not want her to go to a jury trial. And they saw it. They saw she stepped into her power and did really well. And so I was like, huh, you can do this, but you can't clean your room, but you can do this. So like, and I had already gone and testified in Massachusetts before for, that basic bill was, being debated there and a joint committee. And I brought her along because I do think it's so important for a young person to understand how this works. I feel like for me, it makes her safer, because like she's a young, dark skinned Black woman that is going to have to face certain realities in the world. I'm a much older mom. I can't be there forever. And I want to know that she knows exactly how to file a complaint process. I know that she understands where her rights come from, how to engage there, how to push for these things, and how to step into power at that scale. And so I had brought her with me just to observe. Of course, she's like, you're boring. I hate, everything I do is bad, whatever. And I'm like, all right, we got through it. But then after that, I was like, you're going to go testify. So Rhode Island, when they got to this stage where the Senate Labor Committee was hearing this bill, it was the first step in the process this year, only 3 days notice. So we flew up there and her and I both testified. And again, she just knocked it out of the park. And it's what was really incredible. And it kind of goes back to your point too. There was this jerk, Bob. I've already written about Bob on LinkedIn. I don't like Bob. So Bob is a former state senator. and then immediately went into becoming a highest paid lobbyist, or one of the highest paid lobbyists in Rhode Island, represented strip clubs, but then claims to be an expert on workplace dignity. And so he came out, against this bill. And so, but I was looking at him when he was doing it for the Senate and then later on for the House. His arguments are so bad, like astonishingly bad. And I think that's what happens when you get too much power and too much privilege, and you go for decades being unchallenged, that you think you're saying something that's good because no one's been around to say, actually, that's stupid. And so to watch Bob sitting in the background, who had come in with some other fellows, didn't yield any seats to the ladies. So we were all standing outside trying to hear what was going on. And so this gentleman stood there, and I'm watching. Then Cassie goes and she's at this table in front of this row of older white men, a lot of them like Bob, and she wasn't phased at all. I'm reading all this into this scene. I'm looking at this and I'm seeing old guard power. These are the folks who feel they have the right to be here. They don't think I have the right to be here. They're making me wait in the hall and all this. And she didn't pick up on any of this. She was just Gen Z. She walked in there and I think she was honestly like, old people, whatever. And she just like gave her speech, and we were all just in awe of what she had done. Again, still won't clean her room, but I'm like, but I guess you have to pick your battles. And then so I have shared this with the District of Columbia. The Office of Human Rights met with her. Is interested in the bill. They have the bill. They shared that on with a council member who's interested in being a sponsor. We're going to be circling back with them next month once they get through the budget hearings. But we've been sharing everything, and they're excited about working with a young attorney in the making. They're excited that a kid would be so interested. They invite her to meetings and tell her to bring mom. And it's thrilling for me, to see. It's also reassuring. Like I'm like, okay, this kid's gonna do all right when she gets into her adult years. But I also think she's a good news story. She's getting press coverage. We don't always see teens represented in a lovely way in DC. And, her face is in there at a microphone and in a powerful setting in a state house talking about these things with confidence and comfort. And so, on so many levels, I just deeply love it. She's the face of this badass, awesome generation that I really admire.
Wow, that is so. Again, just encouraging. These are the stories that help me feel like we're going to get there. And I think there's a passage in the good book that mentions about the and a child will probably lead us. That I'm really encouraged that this generation Gen Z and even the Gen Alphas, as they get their voice, will come into a world where it's normal to stand up for what you believe. It's normal to uh, to go into a workplace and not have to worry about if I think there's still going to be people who will miss it, who are going to have a bad day, say something that potentially harms someone else. I don't think that will ever stop, but at the very least there would be system to be able to hold those folks accountable. And to repair some of the damage that these folks create. I mean, some of it is just about being human, but we're not really, I think we've gotten better at not having people go out in front of a building and duel each other, for example.
Right,
Yeah,
yeah, we have made some
we've made a
progress.
little bit of progress. At least the incidents of hanging people from trees and a lot of that stuff has gotten better. It's taken hundreds of years to get there, and I think this is another one. I think it's going to get better. I really do, and it's going to take again folks like your daughter and yourself and the folks behind the workplace psychological like Workplace Psychological Safety Act and just other advocates out there. This is what's going to make quite a difference. So thank you so much for the conversation and for the wisdom in your words. Hopefully, there are some HR folks and other folks out there who have heard what you've had to say, and it causes them to think that maybe it might get better. Is there a way? Is there a possibility if folks wanted to follow up with you later? Is there a way to be able to do that to have more conversations around these kind of topics?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. And so it's just LinkedIn, Kimberly E Williams. So I'm pretty easy to find with Walker Advertising. And I get DMs all the time from people asking for help. We've started partnering with legal resources. So, I've added like a link to my page even where you can get help with attorneys. So, there's lots of ways that we can point people to resources if they're really struggling with this. So yeah, like I said, when you've been there, you know how terrible it is. I'm always happy to try and make time for someone and hopefully point them towards somebody who can really help them in their area.
Absolutely. Well, Kim, thanks very much. Thanks very much. This is just wonderful. If you're watching this episode on the Flourish DX YouTube page, please do like, subscribe, and share the episode with your friends. If you're watching or listening to the podcast for the first time, welcome. I hope something that you've heard will bring you back in the future. Previous episodes of the podcast can be found at psychealthandsafetyusa.com. Please do join us, become a part of the Psych Health and Safety USA movement by connecting to us on LinkedIn. And we'll certainly see you next time. And look forward to the next conversation on the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. Thanks very much.